If there is a true, what I would call social paradigm shift here, if we recognize that the growth ethic has to shift, certainly in its emphasis, and indeed overall, let's back up a bit. You know, most of the science says that we need a reduction. It's not a question of growing more efficiently. See, green buildings, the Prius automobile, eco-density, all of the things we're willing to contemplate right now as addressing these kinds of problems really just make us more efficiently unsustainable. What they do is enable us to grow a little more efficiently. So a green building may use 20 or 30% less energy, but it's still adding to the total energy demand of society. Any measure that simply enables you to grow more efficiently, in fact, may be counterproductive, because if you save enough money in the process of being more efficient, you spend it on something else which adds to the environmental load. So we've got to stop thinking about growing more efficiently and actually reducing. We're talking about, in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, an 80% reduction over the next 50 years. That doesn't mean, as we're trying to do in Canada, reducing the energy intensity of further growth. See, the Canadian policy right now is totally at odds with what the science requires. Now, to go back to the original question, if we accept that the science may be right, that it's an absolute reduction that's required, and that's generally accepted by governments, by corporations, and even ordinary people, and then the necessary changes have to take place simultaneously at all of those levels. We need bottom-up responses, individual behavioral change. People should park their cars for the most part, demand better public transit, demand locally produced foods rather than stuff that's shipped halfway around the world. Let's preserve our agricultural land. Heavens knows we get 75% of our table vegetables in North America from California, which most climate experts suggest will be dried up within 50 years. That isn't sound policy then to pave over the, say, the Fraser Valley if we're going to need desperately that agricultural land in 25 or 50 years. So we need to make huge numbers of changes at the individual level that will make demands on the market so that the corporate sector will respond in ways they've never even thought of before. Local governments need to act in ways to improve the urban form so that we can have cities that are effectively much more sustainable than now. Much more resources needs to go into public transit and public amenities than we're willing to put into at the present time. Huge waste in our economy. Look at all of the SUVs running around that do no more 90% of their lives and carry a loaf of bread or a bottle of wine from the corner store to home. If half of the value of those vehicles were pumped into public transit, we could have systems that would pick you up at your home and drive you to work. You wouldn't even need the car, and you could still have a fairly decent car for half the price of a traditional SUV. My point is, we've got the resources, we've got the capacity, we've got the intelligence, but we're not using it because we don't feel sufficiently motivated yet by the...
So having true cost of these resources might be a motivating factor.
That's a huge plus. One thing that the mainstream economy does really well is to direct us toward appropriate purchases, but only if the prices tell the truth. People are wailing today because our gasoline prices have exceeded $1.20 a litre. The real cost of using a litre of gas in Canada probably approaches $4 to $6. Think of the difference if you were paying $4 or $5 or $6 per litre of gasoline. That's all you would need to eliminate inefficient motor vehicles right off the roads, to stay in business, as General Motors, as Ford, as Chrysler are beginning to realize now. They weren't planning ahead. You need to provide vehicles that can go 3, 4, 5 times as far on the fuel that we've got. It's entirely possible right now to do that. The best, most efficient vehicles on the road today are 3 or 4 times better than the worst. So with a little more tweaking, we could have much more efficient vehicles. By the way, I'm not even a fan of having vehicles in the city at all, but that's a huge first step, getting toward the point where we don't waste our fuel on just pure whim, which is really what we're doing in the advertised auto industry.
Well, Europe's been facing high gas prices for decades.
Yeah, and if you go to Italy, the average automobile size is a heck of a lot smaller than it is here. And you know, there's a very interesting phenomenon that seems to have gone unnoticed. If you look at any of the curves that show fossil fuel use, particularly petroleum use in the last century, it's a steady exponential growth curve up until the late 1960s, when it peaks and then falls. It falls steadily for 5 or 6 years and then resumes the exponential growth curve. Well, what happened during that period was the Arab oil embargo and I guess the first war. Anyway, disturbances in the East, Mideast, so that we were temporarily cut off from our oil supplies. Fuel consumption declined. The world didn't collapse. We saw the invention of the Honda Civic and fuel-efficient motor vehicles. This is when wind power got its first big boost. People, as prices rose, began to use less fossil fuel, and alternatives began to emerge. The market was working. So when prices go up, when a resource gets scarcer, it induces the search for alternative. It forces those industries that are dependent on the original resource to become far more efficient in the use of that resource. We should not be afraid of price increases, particularly if we argue that we're a market-based economy. A market-based economy is one which depends on efficient markets, and markets are not efficient if their prices are such that it induces the overuse of scarce resources. And we are underpricing fossil fuel and many other resources, so that when you go to purchase something, most of the costs of that product are being dumped onto the planetary resource base or atmosphere, whatever, and you're not paying for it. Here's another huge problem. China and India are just becoming industrialized. If you think of China and the United States, the U.S. has 0.4% of the world's population, but uses about 1/4 of its commercial energy, 1/4 of its oil resources. China has 4 times the population of the United States. If China achieves its objective of reaching U.S. material standards using the same technologies, then China alone would demand the entire current global energy output at a point when we're probably within a decade of reaching peak oil, the point at which oil production begins to decline. You can see the arithmetic impossibility of accommodating China and the United States, and India wants exactly, and by the way, that doesn't count another 2 billion people, of which Canada and Europe are part. So we've got a tremendous crunch here in the imbalance between potential supply and demand. But that's not my main point. My main point is that the development of China right now, and the Globe and Mail and the National Post have been running articles showing how China's catching up in total CO2 emissions to the United States and a terribly polluted environment and all of that. And in a sense, kind of making China out to be the kind of international bad guy in this game. This is grossly unfair. First of all, most of what's produced in China is for export. Those products are streaming into North America. That camera, these lights, these cases are all made in China. So much of our high-tech manufactured industries and our dirty polluting industries have now been shipped offshore into China. So we do this in order to exploit both the cheap labor, but also the environment of China. So the deteriorating water, atmosphere, and soils of China is part of the ecological footprint of consumers in North America and in Europe who are willing to purchase at far below the total social cost of those goods. I can now buy a laptop computer, I saw one advertised this morning, for $300. The true cost of production of that thing is probably closer to $2,000. But we don't make them here. We make them in China, where they offload those additional costs onto the environment by not enforcing environmental regulations and by exploiting cheap labor. So we are just as guilty as anyone of producing the ecological problems in China, which are now beginning to feed back on the world because of our willingness and indeed our manufactured demand for these cheap products that we bring into this country, carrying that burden, but it's an unpriced burden on the planet, into our marketplace.